Okay, so you want to be an airline pilot. Picture it. You walk down the jetway in 4 stripes, you settle into the left seat of a wide body over the Pacific, and somewhere over the dateline the sun rises twice. The job board said captains at the major carriers earn over $300,000 a year. You've seen the Reddit post, the American Airlines Boeing 737 captain who showed his pay stub, $458,000, year to date, in a single calendar year. People in the comments said he makes in a day what they make in a month. It is a number that stops you. Here is another one. The co-pilot of Continental Connection Flight 3407, which crashed outside Buffalo on the night of February 12, 2009, killing all 50 people on board. She earned $16,254 that year. That is not a typo. She was 24 years old, held a commercial pilot certificate, and was responsible for 49 lives in instrument conditions. She also worked a second job at a coffee shop to make rent, and the night before the crash, she flew as a passenger from Seattle, where she lived with her parents because she couldn't afford the New York metropolitan area, to Newark, in order to show up for her shift. So how does the same license, the same uniform, the same seat, produce a $500,000 pay stub and a $16,000 salary in the same industry? The answer involves a machine you're going to spend a decade building, without realizing you're the one being built into it. You start, like everyone, at the beginning. The application is open. The first thing nobody tells you is that you don't apply to become an airline pilot. You apply to become a student pilot, and then you spend the next several years, and somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000, building a credential that most of the public doesn't know exists, and that the airline you eventually work for will not pay $1 toward. Here is how the costs actually stack. Your private pilot certificate, the license that lets you carry passengers but not charge for it, runs between $10,000 and $18,000. That buys you roughly 60 to 70 hours in the air and the right to call yourself a pilot at parties. You are not close to hireable. Next comes your instrument rating, which qualifies you to fly in clouds. Another $8,000 to $15,000, depending on how fast you learn and how much the rental aircraft costs per hour. Then your commercial certificate, which allows you to be paid to fly, but still doesn't get you near a regional jet. $25,000 to $45,000 more. Then your certified flight instructor certificate, roughly $9,000 to $15,000 in training costs, because this is how you're going to spend the next 2 years of your life, teaching other people to fly for somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000 a year, while you accumulate the hours the FAA requires before an airline can legally hire you. That number is 1,500. 1,500 hours of logged flight time before you can hold an airline transport pilot certificate, the credential that puts you in a regional jet cockpit. Before 2013, it was 250 hours. The change came directly from the wreckage of Flight 3407, and we will come back to that. Add in your FAA knowledge test fees, 7 separate written exams at $175 each, your check ride examiner fees at roughly $1,000 per practical test, the headsets and charts and subscriptions and medical exams that the industry calls incidentals, and that easily total another $3,000 to $5,000, and you are looking at $85,000 on the low end and north of $150,000 if you run slow or if you choose an accelerated academy program that compresses the timeline to 2.5 years. Now here's the gatekeeping detail nobody outside the profession knows exists. Every 6 months, for your entire career, you must pass a first-class FAA medical examination, not a routine physical. A specific battery of tests, cardiovascular, neurological, vision, hearing, administered by an FAA-designated aviation medical examiner, during which any number of conditions that the rest of the working world would manage quietly, with medication, can end your career permanently. Heart disease, diabetes requiring insulin, a seizure history, even certain psychiatric diagnoses. The exam that can take your license costs about $150. What it can take from you is the entire investment you're currently building, plus every year of seniority you'll accumulate on the other side. This is why experienced pilots budget for the existential possibility of the medical. the way other professionals budget for disability insurance. Except disability insurance doesn't pay you what a senior captain makes. Meanwhile, the washout rate for the entry process is not tracked cleanly by any single source, but flight school operators and training programs consistently report that somewhere between 20 and 40% of students who start primary flight training do not finish to the commercial certificate level. The reasons vary: cost overruns, training contract debt, failed check rides, failed medicals, or the simple discovery that the fantasy of flying and the reality of instrument approaches in thunderstorm season are different things. Of the people who start this career with you, roughly 1 in 4 will not make it to the airline interview. Which means that when you add it all up, training costs, instructor fees, examiner fees, 2 years of below-market instructing wages while building hours, you arrive at your first regional airline interview somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 deep, at the age of 26 to 28, before your first airline paycheck has cleared. That's a house down payment, or a medical degree, depending on your zip code. The first paycheck arrives. This is where the real education begins. The headline on the job posting says $95 per hour. You do the math quickly. 95 times 75 hours a month times 12 months equals $85, $500. You've found the answer to your 6-figure question. You have also found the most common misunderstanding in commercial aviation compensation. Because that $95 per hour does not mean what you think it means. Pilots are not paid for hours worked. They are paid for credit hours, specifically, for the time between when the aircraft first moves under its own power and when it stops at the gate. Every other hour of your workday generates exactly $0. The pre-flight inspection? Unpaid. The weather brief? Unpaid. The boarding process? Unpaid. The paperwork? The gate delays? The time spent waiting on the tarmac for an ATC clearance? The post-flight logbook entries? All unpaid. A pilot's actual duty day routinely runs 10 to 12 hours. The credit hours on that same day might total 5 or 6. The FAA caps airline pilots at 1,000 flight hours per year, roughly 83 hours per month, and most pilots fly 70 to 90 credit hours monthly. But total time on duty, including all the unpaid margins, runs 150 to 200 hours a month. So take your $95 and your 75 credit hours. Your gross is $7,125 a month before deductions. But you worked 175 hours to earn it. That's $40.71 per hour of actual time on duty. The gas station across the terminal pays $17. You're ahead, but you're not ahead by as much as the posting suggested. Now the deductions. Federal income tax at your bracket. State income tax, which varies wildly depending on whether your airline bases you in Texas or California, and you don't get to choose your base, at least not until you have enough seniority. Social Security and Medicare. Union dues, which at the major carriers run $80 to $120 per month, but which also fund the contract that defines your pay rate and your working conditions, so they are not optional and not entirely unwelcome. These standard deductions take a first-year regional first officer earning $85,000 gross down to roughly $60,000 to $65,000 in take-home pay, depending on the state. Then the expenses the job creates that nobody reimburses. The uniform. Your airline provides some pieces and charges you for others, and the total initial outlay for the full kit, shirts, epaulets, pants, hat, shoes, bag, runs $500 to $1,500 out of pocket. The headset, $800 to $1,200 for a quality noise-canceling set, and you need it. The iPad with aviation charts and approach plates, plus the subscriptions that keep it current, roughly $600 to $800 per year. The continuing education credits and recurrent training documents that your certificate requires, variable but real. And then there's the commute. Here is the hidden cost nobody budgets in the first year. Most junior pilots are not based where they live. The airline assigns you to a base, Chicago, Dallas, Newark, Atlanta, and the bidding system that would let you transfer somewhere livable requires seniority you don't have yet. So you commute. You fly standby on your own airline's flights, in the jump seat or a passenger seat, from wherever you actually live to wherever the airline needs you. This costs you time and money. The crash pads, Shared apartments near crew bases, rented by the bunk, run $300 to $600 per month. Some pilots spend the night in the crew lounge to save the money, sleeping on a couch before showing up for a 6 a.m. departure. The NTSB has a phrase for the cumulative result of this arrangement. They call it a recipe for an accident. Now run the honest math for 1 month. Gross flight pay at $95 per hour, 75 credit hours guaranteed, $7,125. Per diem, the tax-advantaged daily allowance you receive while away from base, typically $2.50 to $3 per hour of duty time, adds perhaps $400 to $500. Total gross before taxes, roughly $7,600. Federal and state taxes, FICA, union dues, minus $2,200. Uniform amortization, headset, subscriptions, minus $120. Crash pad, minus $400. Commute flights that cost you standby fees or the occasional full fare when the standby doesn't work, minus $150. Net in hand, approximately $4,730 per month. Divide by 175 actual duty hours, $27.03 per hour. That's the true entry rate for a profession requiring $100,000 in upfront investment and a credential that took 3 years to build. There is a real person attached to this math. Rebecca Shaw, the first officer aboard Flight 3407, earned $16,254 in her final year at Colgan Air. $21 per credited flight hour, not per duty hour. She held a second job at a coffee shop. She lived with her parents in Seattle because she couldn't afford rent near her Newark base. The NTSB determined she was fatigued on the night of February 12, 2009. She was probably fighting a cold. The cockpit voice recorder captured her yawning on approach. She was 24 years old. She had been a pilot for the airline for 13 months, and she was responsible for 49 passengers and crew in icing conditions in the dark. The math wasn't what broke her, but it is not unrelated to what happened. The math, though, is not what breaks most people in this career. Something else does, and it has a name. The trap has a name. In the airline industry, it's called the seniority list, and it is the single most powerful force in a pilot's professional life. More powerful than your skill, your experience, your credentials, your performance reviews, or your personal preferences. It determines what you fly, when you fly it, where you're based, whether you're a captain or a first officer, what holidays you work, and whether you have a job at all when the industry contracts. Your seniority number is assigned on your date of hire. It never improves except by the departure, through retirement, resignation, or termination, of everyone hired before you. And here is the part that makes it a trap rather than merely a system. Your seniority number belongs to one airline. If that airline fails, your number goes with it. You start over at 0. Watch how this tightens. Year 1, you're a junior first officer on reserve, which means the airline calls you with less than 2 hours' notice to cover trips other pilots have dropped. You work Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving. You have no control over your schedule. You tell yourself it's temporary. Year 3, you've moved up the list enough to hold a line. A regular monthly schedule, bid through seniority, so senior pilots get the good trips and you get the 4 a.m. turns. You've also accumulated $15,000 more in debt servicing the training loans, and your seniority here is now worth more than starting fresh somewhere else. Year 7, you're approaching captain upgrade at the regional, which would double your pay, but the major airlines are hiring, and if you jump to a major, you restart at the very bottom of their list. You have to make a decision about which list to bet your career on, and the stakes are everything you've built. Now here is who profits from this structure. The major carriers, Delta, United, American, run what the industry calls a regional feed system. They contract with smaller airlines to operate their short-haul routes under their brand, their logo, their passenger expectations. The regional carrier hires and trains the pilots, pays them regional wages, bears the cost of the infrastructure, and the major carrier captures the revenue. A first officer flying 70-seat jets under the United Express banner for SkyWest Airlines earns a regional salary. United Airlines does not pay that pilot. United's aircraft, United's gates, United's passengers, United's profit. Someone else's payroll. The regional system is not an accident. It is the structural solution the major carriers found to the question of how to staff short-haul flying without paying long-haul wages. Then the system showed everyone exactly what it was. On February 12, 2009, Continental Connection Flight 3407, operated by Colgan Air under the Continental brand, with Continental's logo on the tail, stalled on approach to Buffalo Niagara International Airport and crashed into a house in Clarence Center, New York. All 49 people aboard and one person on the ground were killed. The NTSB investigation revealed that the captain had failed 5 previous flight performance checks that his own airline had failed to fully document. The first officer was earning $16,254 a year and had commuted overnight from Seattle on 2 cargo planes to show up for her shift. The NTSB board member who presided over the hearing called the conditions a recipe for an accident. Congress was, in their own words, stunned to learn how little the pilots responsible for their constituents' lives were actually earning. In 2013, the FAA responded with a rule change, the 1,500-hour requirement for the ATP certificate. The threshold for regional first officers had previously been 250 hours. Overnight, the pipeline to a regional cockpit became 6 times longer. The rule was designed to ensure that pilots had more experience before assuming airline responsibilities. It had a secondary effect that nobody advertised. It made the pipeline so expensive and so long that regional airlines struggled to staff their aircraft, triggering pilot shortages that ultimately forced the wages upward. The crash that exposed poverty wages at regional airlines became the mechanism that eventually began to fix them, 17 years later. Your version of this story is not scheduled for a particular date, but the mechanism is the same one that ran in 2009. The regional system still exists. The seniority clock is still running, and the retirement clock has already started, whether you know it yet or not. So the only question that actually matters is whether, across the full length of a career, the whole thing adds up. It's time to run that math. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. Does being an airline pilot actually pay? Run it as an investment across 3 realistic arcs, and the answer turns out to be, it depends entirely on which arc you're in and when you started. The median career. You enter a regional airline at 27, after 3 years of training and 2 years of instructing. You spend 4 years at the regional working up from first officer to captain, then transition to a major carrier, where you restart at the bottom of the seniority list. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts the median airline pilot salary at $226,600 as of 2024, but that's the median across the entire career range, not year 1. Your first decade looks much worse. Regional first officer years at $85,000 to $120,000. Early major years at $100,000 to $150,000. With the real earning power arriving in years 15 through 35 as you climb toward captain. You hit mandatory retirement at 65. If you entered at 27, you have 38 years in the cockpit, assuming you keep passing the medical every 6 months and your airline never files for bankruptcy. Gross career earnings across 38 years, with median pay weighted across the progression, somewhere between $6 million and $9 million before taxes. Subtract your training debt of $120,000 plus the interest on it over the repayment period. Subtract the hidden drain, the commuting years, the crash pad years, the uniform and equipment costs, the 2 years of below-market instructing wages foregone at entry. Your lifetime net, in constant dollars, is strong. But your effective hourly rate in the first decade is not what the job posting suggested. The path that wins. You enter a major airline at 25 through a university aviation program with a restricted ATP at 1,000 hours. Ride the seniority list through a stable carrier with no bankruptcies, upgrade to captain at year 12, and make it to a senior wide-body international captain position. In 2026, that pilot earns $400,000 to $500,000 per year, with profit sharing adding 10 to 15% on top. A 777 captain at a legacy carrier earns roughly $484 per credited flight hour. This version of the career pays extraordinarily well in its final third. The question is what percentage of entrants reach it. The answer involves how many airlines fold, how many pilot groups get furloughed, and how many medicals get failed on the way. The FAA's historical medical disqualification data suggests about 4.7 per 1,000 active airline pilots are denied certification each year, a number that rises steeply after age 45 and is driven primarily by cardiovascular disease. Delta's pilot pension plan, when the airline filed for bankruptcy in 2005, had $4.7 billion in obligations against $1.7 billion in assets. The gap, roughly $3 billion, evaporated for those pilots. U.S. Airways terminated its pilot pension plan in 2003, emerging from its post-9/11 bankruptcy, and those pilots spent the next decade working for industry-low wages with no retirement savings to show for the previous years. After September 11, 2001, more than 7,000 airline pilots, 7.5% of the U.S. pilot workforce, were furloughed. Some returned within 2 years. Others waited more than 11 years. The exit value. The skills transfer modestly outside Part 121 aviation. Corporate flight departments, charter operators, and fractional ownership programs will hire you without an age ceiling, so pilots who lose their first-class medical after 65 or choose to leave before mandatory retirement can often continue flying smaller aircraft in less regulated settings. Simulator instruction is another common second act. What doesn't transfer is the seniority. The 20 years you spent climbing a particular airline's list represent an asset that evaporates the day you leave. There is no portability, no converting your place in one queue to a position in another. When an airline fails or a pilot is furloughed, what they lose isn't just the job. It's the accumulated position, a resource that took decades to build and cannot be rebuilt in the time that remains. Here is the honest ledger, both sides. What this life genuinely gives that spreadsheets miss? The view at 41,000 feet over the North Atlantic on a clear night when you can see the curvature of the Earth and the stars are below you. And that is not nothing. Real authority and real responsibility in a machine that demands competence, which has a particular satisfaction that is hard to replicate in most professions. More consecutive days off per month than almost any office job, 12 to 18 at most major airlines, which is an unusual kind of time that pilots use differently than the general population expects. And, in the career's final third, earnings that are genuinely in the top few % of American workers. What this life genuinely takes that recruiters never mention, your body runs on a clock that airline operations will spend 3 decades disrupting. Research published in 2025 found that 89% of airline personnel reported fatigue and 71% reported sleep disturbances. Circadian disruption, cosmic radiation exposure on transpolar routes, and irregular mealtimes are linked in the medical literature to elevated rates of melanoma, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic syndrome. You will not sleep a full night on a natural schedule for most of your career. The mandatory retirement at 65 is not a suggestion. On your 65th birthday, your career ends. Not when you're ready, not when the market is good, not when you've had a chance to taper down. The date is fixed, known years in advance, and it arrives regardless of your financial readiness. The Medicare IRMA surcharge that hits you at 65 is calculated from your income 2 years prior, which means the government will charge you premium prices for Medicare based on the peak salary of a career that ended the same month you enrolled. Who this life actually pays? The person who enters a stable major carrier before age 30, keeps their first-class medical through their 50s, survives at least one industry contraction without losing their seniority list position, has a financial plan for the forced retirement at 65, and is genuinely comfortable with the lifestyle, the commuting years, the holiday scheduling, the circadian disruption, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a permanent feature of the job for most of the career. For that person, this is one of the best-paying blue-collar professions in the country, and one of the few that combines genuine mastery with genuine compensation. Who it quietly bankrupts? The person who enters a regional carrier, accumulates 5 years of seniority, watches that carrier merge or fail, restarts at 0 somewhere else at 35, never quite catches the seniority wave that would move them into real earnings, and arrives at 65 with a modest 401k and a career that the world perceived as glamorous, but that the pay stubs describe as something different. Here is the pattern the numbers reveal. Once you see it in aviation, you will recognize it everywhere. The industry that employs you is structured so that your most essential years, the entry years, when you are most available, most trainable, most willing to accept whatever conditions the job offers, are also your lowest paid years. The leverage flows upward. The seniority system, the regional feed structure, the mandatory retirement